learned a lot. Also learned so many, you can say, different cultures, different practices. And it's really a very worthy platform where we exchange our ideas, learn from each other. Today, I think we are having a very important topic to be discussed. This important topic, I think, it's because especially after Donald Trump coming to power in the United States, you can see that almost every day news is about what tariff rates are going to be there, whether those tariff rates are going to be retaliatory, whether they are going to be punitive, whether they are going to be constructive, what kind of responses other countries are going to have. So these are the main questions which are being uh, raised in all newspapers, television media, and even social media across the globe. I think today I was watching a speech of Singaporean Prime Minister in his parliament, and that was quite impressive. He was saying that the rule-based order, which probably today we are going to learn in detail, that rule-based order where free trade was conceptualized, where I think free exchanges were conceptualized, learning from one another was conceptualized. Those things are being challenged by American policymakers. But this is not the only issue. The rule-based multilateral order, which we know, that has been challenged time to time by different players and different incidents in the global politics. One of those important episodes have been Ukraine crisis, Ukraine war, the way Russia encroached in Ukrainian territory and the way the war has been lingering for more than almost 3 years. I think it's really a very sad state of affair. And the way all the rules, all the norms, all the, you can say, institutions, they have not been able to contain this conflict has also been very spectacular, you can say, example that is far, I think, the system is really in, you can say, strain, and we need to address this issue. Uh, as I think the topic is very timely, and I think it's going to help us because through the example of South Korea, Professor Ian Watson actually is going to bring some sense to this so-called disorder in our minds because we don't know what's happening and who is doing what. For example, if we look at South Korean politics also, you will understand that how the opinions are so much divided, especially whether 2022, when South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol first time he participated in NATO summit, whether that was a good move or bad move, whether it was a response to crumbling, you can say, rule-based order, or say more connection of China, North Korea, Russia, or whether this was a, you can say, reason why North Korea and Russia they got together more closely in subsequent years. So we are not very sure about how to deal. I think Conservative Party people they have different opinion. Liberal Progressive Party, so-called Democratic Party, they have different opinion. So I think this lecture is going to be enlightening both for a Korean audience as well as through the Korean case study that in this kind of situation, what should a middle power like South Korea should do? And I think Professor Ian Boston has a, you can say, he has written paper on middle power also. He has written paper about multiculturalism, foreign aid, institutions. And I think nobody could be more qualified to speak on this topic. If I have to briefly speak about his formal some achievements. He has done PhD and MA in International Studies from Newcastle University, UK. He had taught politics at Newcastle University and Durham University. He had published lots of work on Korean foreign policy, Korean foreign aid, multiculturalism, and various international, you can say, issues. He had published a book also with Routledge publication, very prestigious in 2014, on the topic Korean foreign aid and emerging donors in Asia. He also simultaneously works with several NGOs uh, uh, in New East of England, as well as he has been project support coordinator for refugee-based project in different parts of the world. So I think he is a very well qualified to help us to make sense of global world order and how a country make choices. Now the floor is to Professor Watson.
Thank you very much. Before I start, first I'd like to thank Professor Kang for inviting me here today to talk to you about this topic of Korea and NATO, and as you rightly say, this disorder that we see emerging now in the world. And I'd also like to thank you very much for that very, very kind introduction. So you've raised a lot of very high expectations. So I hope I'll be able to meet those expectations. So I'd like to switch to the slides now, if that's possible. So I'll do the share screen. And here we are. Okay. There. Is that seen? Yes, I think that's working all right. Okay, so thank you very much. So I'm not sure how long I've got to talk for. 30 minutes, 35 minutes. Is that about right? We'll see how it goes.
Yes, please.
Okay. So yes, so this topic I focus on. Actually, I've been working on this topic now for a couple of years, really since the I was going to say that the current Yoon administration, but the former Yoon administration produced this document in 2022, two documents. One was called a Global Pivotal State, and I'll explain a little bit what that means during today's presentation. And the other I saw as quite significant, the Indo-Pacific strategy, which Korea introduced 3 years ago now under the Yoon administration. Now, this is very typical of Korean administrations. In Korea, we have a system, a presidential system, where we have a president who has a fixed term of 5 years. So we tend to see a pattern where each president has a specific view or specific approach to foreign policy. And this foreign policy is almost like an identity issue for each president. And the problem is when a new president comes in, everything that went before is just put away and forgotten about. So there's this pattern in Korea where we have these moments where specific strategies emerge. And maybe I'll talk a little bit about the history of that in today's session, because that is very symptomatic of Korea's role as a middle power, as an evolving middle power over the last 20 or 30 years. So this relationship between Korea and NATO at the start is a very odd one, because here we have a Euro-Atlantic organization founded in 1949. And here we have an Asia-Pacific middle power really kind of pushing its boundaries, or pushing above its weight, as we like to call this, a middle power vocabulary, in the late 90s, early 2000s, coming from a completely different region. So it's very strange that when we talk about NATO, we're talking about Korea as an East Asia or Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific. But when we look at the history of this relationship, and I'll talk about this in a moment, Korean War actually played a big part in the original foundation of NATO in 1949 and the institution of NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty, as an organization into the 1950s and through to 60s and 70s. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And then we have the history, certainly a post-Cold War era, of Korea in the mid-2000s becoming very globalized, and it enjoys a lot of visibility, Korean soft power. Professor Kang mentioned the kind of cultural identity of Korea, the K-pop, all that kind of thing was very big in the mid-2000s, global Korea in the 2010s. So when Korea partnered with NATO in 2005, there was a sense that this represented very much this new visibility for Korea as a middle power. I'll talk more about this history in a moment. So really this relationship, this partnering, starts in 2005, which is really the beginnings, if you like, of Korea's role as a bridge nation in Northeast Asia, and gradually getting more visibility in various multilateral organizations. And then we have this upgrade, if you like, under the Yoon administration in 2022. And that's when I became involved and quite interested in this relationship between NATO and Korea, basically asking the question, what is Korea doing? Why is it getting involved with NATO? It's a completely different region. It's way, relatively far away in physical, geographical terms. But when you saw this in terms of NATO and the global pivotal state in Indo-Pacific, then there seemed to be something else going on regarding regions, regarding regional boundaries, regional identities. And indeed, this very term Indo-Pacific itself is very unique. It's a very relatively modern term. It was coined in 2007, actually, in a joint meeting between India and Japan in 2007. And actually, Donald Trump in his first administration took this word Indo-Pacific on to focus on US foreign policy in the region. So there's this kind of strange chronology between Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific. Actually, Indo-Pacific came first. And then we have Asia-Pacific under the Obama administration a little bit later on into the 2010s. And that regional issue, the boundary issue, the identity issues, what I want to turn to in a moment, because whilst my paper looks at the various advantages and disadvantages of Korea's role with NATO, my underlying argument is Korea needs to seriously loosen its ties with NATO as soon as possible. But the motivations for joining NATO are multifarious, some contradictory. A lot of writers would say that basically it was all about the Yoon administration trying to lock Korea further into the US foreign policy, especially under the Biden administration. That moment is well and truly gone now. And even at that stage, there was a sense, and certainly kind of some of my writing was quite critical of some of the assumptions about Korea as a middle power in NATO. And the assumption was everything's great, it's reinforcing Korea's security, it's not a problem. And I saw this as a problem back then, and certainly as a problem now. And for that reason, I want to identify some implications of Korea's NATO partnering in today's session. NATO's, or rather Korea's partner with NATO is actually part of the NATO Partners Across the Globe program, which actually includes many nations right across the different regions of the world. It's quite interesting to track how the partners have joined up with NATO over the few years and how that represents and reflects some of the power dynamics and some of the relationships between many middle powers, whether it's in Latin America or Africa or Southeast Asia, South Asia. So maybe we can look at that issue as well in a moment. So my contents here, basically, I'm going to start off with the history of Korea and NATO. I'm going to look at some of the domestic responses to why Korea joined NATO and some of the wider context in terms of the international system in the Asia-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific. I'm going to look at some of the critiques of Korea partnering with NATO, some of the implications regarding NATO, but in my view have been very much ignored and underestimated. One issue that keeps coming up regarding Korea's NATO partnering is the issue of nuclear deterrence. That's very much becoming part of mainstream in Korea now. And of course, this is very much impacted on Korea's NATO partnering, given that NATO essentially is a nuclear deterrence organization. It's an organization based on collective security. Article 5, I'll turn to in a moment, and also an organization which actually promotes nuclear non-proliferation. So we have a lot of debates, not quite too mainstream in Korea, but it's definitely out there, that many commentators on the left and right, liberals and conservatives for different reasons, are saying this is the time now for Korea to think about having its own nuclear program, whether that's in terms of sharing nuclear information with NATO members, with the US, or actually having its own program. Now, I don't want to emphasize that too much because it's not quite in the kind of discussions in Korea, but it's certainly moving in. And I think what we see now with the Trump administration and the America First and the populist movement across Europe and America and so on is a real recalibration, recalculation of Korea's relationship, not just with the great powers, but also with middle powers and partners within the Asia-Pacific region. And if I can be a little bit controversial towards the end of today's session and my conclusion, one thing I've often thought about living in Korea for a while now is this kind of rearticulation of conservative and liberal progressive attitudes towards Japan and China. So my view is that there's obviously a presidential election coming up here in about 56, 57 days time. My view is actually there's a space here for the progressives to rearticulate their approach to Japan and perhaps get something positive out of that. Because historically in Korea, the progressives have tended to be rather suspicious and very critical of Japan for historical reasons and so forth. So maybe we can look at that a little bit later on. So I can just turn very briefly here to the history of Korea and NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty, which is the original treaty which essentially morphs into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was very heavily influenced by the Korean War. So right at the start, there was always a link between Korea and NATO. And of course, this is very much part of the narrative that the Korean War was the first hot war, if you like, of the Cold War. Very the same year of the Chinese Communist Revolution in 1949. We have the start of the Korean War in 1950. Even during the Korean War time, there were calls from certain generals in the United States to think about the use of nuclear weapons. There was that massive debate about whether nuclear weapons should be used against China. The Americans had already used nuclear weapons in Japan, of course, at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So these debates were around. So this issue of nuclear deterrence and NATO was already tied into the Korean War very, very early on. And of course, that has implications throughout the 1990s and 2000s regarding nuclear non-proliferation, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Actually, that's not new. That's always been an issue going back to 1950, the start of the Korean War. So the Cold War plays very much a part in this. And then in 1953, you have the Mutual Defense Treaty between the United States and Korea, and that plays a major part in the whole kind of security apparatus within the Asia-Pacific region, or East Asia at the time. And of course, it's one of the issues now why Korea and Japan and many Asia-Pacific partners are really concerned of what's happening in the United States. It's kind of 80 years contract, if you like, between US security umbrella in the region and protection, the security guarantee and protection of its allies. Legally, it's still there. There's still very much a commitment. But clearly, politically, if we can see a difference between politics and legality here, that kind of assumption that the US will come and support an ally in the region from an attack and go along with its allied obligations is perhaps not quite so secure anymore. And I think a lot of people were concerned a few weeks ago regarding Ukraine, when the Americans really wanted to see the security guarantee of Ukraine, not as a legal security guarantee, but as part of a bargain. And I think that really concerned a lot of commentators. If that's the attitude from the Trump administration, then what happens to the 80-year US security umbrella? Because one of the ironies of this is that the United States, right from very early on, saw its role as supplying military aid, military protection, security guarantee for the region, for its allies in the region, mainly for deterrence, but also, as international relations tells us, the great big hegemonic powers, the powerful states, are actually also concerned about their own allies, but their own allies might start to fight with each other. So the big power has to kind of lock in allies to the overall security umbrella. And of course, the concern now is that if the allies can't trust that security umbrella, they will begin to turn on each other, and there could be an arms race beginning to emerge in East Asia. And the worry, of course, is that the Trump administration would say, well, that's absolutely fine by us because it's not costing us anything. That's Korea and Japan, Australia, New Zealand, that's their problem. So there is definitely a shift. Whether that's all rhetoric, whether it's all bluff, we're not sure yet, quite clearly. It's very early on. But these ideas are clearly becoming more mainstream in the media now, and that's starting to make allies a little bit edgy, a little bit concerned about where they stand now with the US security umbrella. But the history of this does go back to 1945 and the kind of emergence of US hegemony. We call this model the US security umbrella. Of course, this impacts the Philippines, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Thailand as well. We also call it the hub and spoke model, where the Americans also have bilateral agreements with Japan, with Korea. It's all part of this great big American system. And what's interesting on debates on NATO at the moment is that NATO has been quite happy for the security umbrella, certainly during the Cold War and even the post-Cold War era, when NATO itself has gone under a kind of identity evolution, because NATO, of course, is the quintessential Cold War organization. So if you don't have a Cold War, then why do we have a Cold War organization? So NATO itself has been going through this evolution. And of course, this is the debate now in Asia Pacific about whether you're seeing the continuation of a Cold War or whether we've seen a new kind of Cold War emerging. And I want to come to that issue actually in a moment about the terminology we use. But the origins of this go back to 1949 and 1950 and this whole US hub and spoke model regarding NATO. So in a way, it was no surprise that the Yoon administration in 2022, and indeed the administrations of the 2000s and 2010, saw NATO as a good way to lock in and further Korea's relations with the United States. The United States, of course, being a founder member of NATO. So it made a lot of sense. It was good for Korea. Korea was also emerging at that time in 2005 as a kind of middle power, as very economically developed. Korean soft power, and Korea also in the mid 2000s was I would say taking advantage of relative peace and quiet in the Asia Pacific. China wanted a stable environment to economically grow. Russia had domestic economic issues, and Russia was also focused in the Caucasus, the conflicts in Georgia and post-Chechnya and so on. So in the Asia Pacific, there was this kind of moment of calm. It's kind of hard to believe now, but it is 20 years ago. And this space, if you like, allowed countries, especially countries recovering from a 1997 Asian financial crisis like the Philippines, Thailand, to really begin to grow again as middle income, high middle income states. And part of the manifestation of those economic resources was this interest in visibility and multilateral institutions. So Korea joins the G20 in 2010, the OECD DAC, but actually NATO was earlier than that. So Korea really saw an opportunity to join an American-led multilateral organization. And actually, Korean troops and Korean humanitarian aid was also being taken to Afghanistan. It was going to help post-conflict zones in the Middle East and East Africa as well. And the argument basically was that this is good for US-Korea relations and would enhance Korea's prestige and visibility in multilateral organizations. So it did make a lot of sense. And what Yoon did in 2022 was basically to upgrade this to lock Korea very much into various NATO operations in cybersecurity, humanitarian, post-conflict aid. Korea opened a NATO office in Brussels in 2022, it's the same year as the Indo-Pacific strategy, and really fed into that whole NATO trans-regional approach I'll come to in a moment. Korean delegates and heads of state were also involved in NATO summits in Madrid in 2022 and Vilnius, Lithuania, 2023. So very much, very, very active in NATO as a trans-regional organization. But there was still this question mark, even domestic Korean politics as to why. Why was Korea getting involved in NATO? And there are advantages and disadvantages to this I'll turn to in a moment. So essentially with the domestic debate talks about, well, conservative and liberal. I don't want to generalize conservatives and liberals. There's kind of inherent polarization I put on the screen there, but it is a bit more fluid and a bit more flexible and complex than that. So the conservatives, liberal, progressives. And a very interesting point made in the introduction that, and maybe this is part of what's happening now with populism, is that our ideas of left wing and right wing are now becoming more complicated and more paradoxical and more contradictory. So I'm really generalizing here, but generally conservatives over the last 20 years have seen NATO rather as a way to lock in further to the US alliance and security system, to say to the United States, look, we're not just focused parochially on Asia Pacific, we are generally a global Korea, and we would like to get involved in NATO operations in the Euro-Atlantic, wherever NATO is involved. We'll be there, we'll be your trusted mediator. If you need us, just give us a call and we'll come and help. So it's very much part of that US alliance. During the Yoon administration, this was seen as confirmation of a very strong US-Korea alliance. For others, there was a sense that there was almost too much confirmation, that perhaps it represented a slight concern from both sides that this alliance may be in trouble. So again, one of the paradoxes of politics, the more flattery there is, and the more linking, the more handshakes, the more friendly noises coming, is actually a sign of insecurity rather than security. If it was really secure, Korea didn't have to do that, didn't need to do that. Many conservative voices, there's a few conservative voices kind of which are anti-NATO. Again, that argument, why is Korea getting involved? Sending resources to NATO when resources should be staying here in South Korea as a national security deterrent against North Korea. There's also cultural issues there regarding national sovereignty and so on. But anti-NATO really plays more of a part in the progressive, democratic, progressive movement. So the conservative argument, as ever, is more about national security. But what's interesting is that the original partnering of NATO and Korea in 2005 was actually during a democratic, progressive presidency. So what's interesting is that NATO, I would suggest the original reason why Korea joined NATO was, in a sense, not to secure the US security alliance, but actually to say to the United States, look, we have other options, almost to loosen the US security alliance. And that's something that many democratic progressives like, because they see the United States and all great powers in the region as essentially stopping Korean unification and being a provocation between the two Koreas. So you take away the great foreign powers, you let the Koreas sort their own problems out, and there will be reunification. So a lot of progressives see the kind of existence of the US and the US army bases in South Korea as a problem and as provoking North Korea. So, there's a kind of a strange kind of paradox there that the progressives were originally pro-NATO to open up options, but also anti-NATO as well. What you don't see in Korea or any civil society protests about Korea and NATO, that's usually what we see, or we did see during the Cold War in many parts of Western Europe, that NATO essentially was part of the military industrial complex. It was provoking the Soviets. It's a nuclear deterrence. It's dangerous. NATO says it's collective security, but it's not. There was that old argument during the Cold War that NATO was founded before the Warsaw Pact. So NATO was more offensive than defensive. But you don't tend to see that in Korea. Generally, there's a sense that NATO could be useful for Korea's visibility and options. So that's pretty good in terms of national power and national identity. But I'll come to some of those issues in a moment. So let me just scroll down here. So again, sort of I mentioned here, it was mentioned in the introduction that the basic argument has been that the United States in the region has been a security guarantor, and the United States as a regional hegemon to maintain its security interests and economic interests in the region is essentially, or has been essentially, promoting a kind of rules-based international order. Multilateral rules-based order, value-based order. So the idea of promoting liberal values, democratic values. We often hear the word like-minded states. That was a big kind of cliche of the Yoon administration. So Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy, of which NATO was a part, was locking into this sense of the international rules-based order. And what tended to happen, and has happened over the last 3 or 4 years, was that the previous administration saw the Indo-Pacific as upholding this rules-based order. And that was a region completely separate and very clearly bounded off from what was seen as the Eurasian or autocratic international order coming from Iran, China, Russia, and North Korea. So when North Korea and Russia made a military pact during the Ukraine war, this is again seen as confirmation that Eurasian states are the threat. They may be communist states, but they're autocratic states, they're rogue states, and therefore Korea has to embed itself with the rules-based order, which basically means pro-United States allies in the region, European pro-US and European Union countries, and different parts of the world as well, where NATO has its global partners. So that was the assumption. So it's kind of very much Cold War mindset, these kind of two blocks, these bipolar blocks emerging. And it was very much based on the assumption that the United States was the rules-based order, value-based order, and would be willing to supply that to its allies. So the way that was framed was that certain states don't like this rules-based order and essentially want to break off from it, from de-link from it. So there's a lot of talk about 10 or 15 years ago about China de-linking, decoupling from the United States order, the BRICS, all this kind of movement coming in, and that whole debate about, whether China wants to create its own new world order, was happy to be in the US world order, but kind of re-changed it or recalibrated a bit. And of course, one of the ironies here was, and we're seeing that now, is that China very much took advantage of the United States liberal world order. They got very rich out of liberal world order. Of course, this is, at the moment, this is Trump's big complaint, that China has basically been free riding on the American consumer. And that issue with tariffs, which is very much tied into this. So the MAGA and Trump very much saying that America is essentially kind of victim in all this and being taken advantage of. And China has benefited from the US-led world order. So that's really a little bit different from other debates, which said actually China is creating its own world order with the BRICS and New Development Bank and a Sino-centric East Asia and so on. So again, we haven't quite resolved that debate. So two things, these two dynamics are occurring now, and I think these two dynamics have big implications for Korea. So the first dynamic is essentially that maybe these states are not wanting to create an alternative world order. They want to still reside within the US-led world order, but have a different vision of how they see institutions should work and how they see how multipolarity works. There's quite interesting work now being done on China and Russia in their version of multipolarity. And of course, what's significant here is that China and Russia are United Nations Permanent Security Council members. They have a big stake in the current international system. So why on earth would they want to disrupt the current international system? And of course, Russia and China's complaint has always been that actually the US who disrupts the international system with the various interventions and wars over the last 20 or 30 years. So we have that dynamic that maybe China and Russia are actually quite happy with this system, but just want it reformed. And the second point, the ironic point now, is that the United States actually wants to disrupt its own system. Okay, that's something very, very new. We've basically just seen over the last 2 or 3 months or 2 or 3 weeks. So all those debates about US hegemony, about the free riding, about the relationship between allies, that now is very, very disordered. Okay, so when a hegemonic state, which is still a very powerful state, starts to challenge its own order, certainly that is scaring a lot of international relations theorists because it doesn't make sense anymore. This is not meant to happen. I suspect a lot of this is bluff, but sometimes bluff can generate unintended consequences. And I think Trump found that in the last 12 hours with the tariff rhetoric, that he's really understood that people respond to these words and actions and generate unintended consequences. But my view is this uncertainty is impacting very strongly, will impact very strongly on Korea's response to all this. So I suppose going a little bit back to the domestic question on how Korea looks at NATO. Again, I don't want to generalize the progressive and the conservative response, but these are generally the critical assessments that come out in various debates in Korea. Essentially, Korea is generating a kind of new form of dependency on the US and on NATO. It's getting locked in to various supply chains, which are going to exhaust Korea's resources, just what it needs, and just when it needs those resources, with North Korea and Russia and maybe China. One of the big issues during the Yoon administration, and many of Yoon's supporters in the academic world as well, were saying, look at this, Korea is now very high up the league table of providing lethal aid and military aid. It's got missiles, it's got tanks, sending to Poland, to Norway, to the United States. Of course, Korea is not allowed legally to send military equipment directly to a belligerent state, a conflict in other parts of the world, but it certainly can be part of the supply chain. So Korea has been very, adept and very active in this. Now, clearly, this is very good for the economic sectors in Korea who are making this stuff. But there's also a bit of skepticism as to, why is Korea doing this? It's getting itself tied into all these supply chains. And of course, it makes it very difficult for Korea to break out of these supply chains because questions will be asked. And Korea could be very, very isolated, very excluded from this. There was also another issue raised about a year ago when North Korea started to supply arms and military equipment to Russia in Ukraine. Technically, we have a Korean war going on in Ukraine because the South Koreans are, by proxy, providing Ukraine materials. And of course, North Korea is providing Russian materials. That's South Korea, North Korea going at it in Ukrainian battleground. So that was something that was highlighted about a year ago, but has kind of dropped out a little bit. But it's clearly an important part of this about this question: why is Korea operating in a region where it's not traditionally known to be a major player? Other issues involved, and one I'm going to focus on a little bit later, is this question of reputation. So Korea has grown a very, very expansive reputation, and I think part of that is why many students and many people visit Korea. Okay, so this is always part of the pull of Korean soft power, but it's very active in the region. As I mentioned previously, each president in Korea has its own approach to regional geopolitics. We have the Global Korea, we have Eurasia Initiative, we have the Northern Policy, the Southern Policy of the Moon Jae-in administration. So each president has their own perspective on the region, but very clearly Korea has been very active with ASEAN individually and bilaterally. And indeed, under the administration and the global pivotal state, Korea was very active in Chip 4 with the US, Japan, and Taiwan. It was interested in AUKUS, the kind of agreement between Australia, UK, and US. It's very active in ASEAN when it comes to trade deals. So, that's the visibility of Korea over the last two or three decades. And the paradox, of course, that the more Korea gets involved regionally, why is it getting involved outside the region? one of the mindsets in Korea is that as Korea becomes more powerful within the region, then it's able to push out a little bit into a more trans-regional approach or global Korea approach. And that visibility essentially will feed back into the region. One of the arguments I'm going to raise a little bit later is that that sense of feedback is now becoming very, very counterproductive. And in my view, a more pragmatic response now for Korea would be to wind down these associations and these obligations with organizations like NATO, because Europe itself is changing now, and I'll come to that in a moment, and get back to basics, get back to the region and start to rebuild relations with the regional partners. So the reputation that Korea is a kind of foreign donor, trade, trusted, experienced, it's gone through conflict, it's gone through colonization. That's a very important part of Korean soft power. And my own view is that Korea, by partnering with NATO, is basically giving that away. That key soft power has been given away. And of course, in today's world now, where we have the tariff issue and all states now are kind of working out where their friends are, friend shoring, we call it, it's absolutely vital now for Korea, in my view, to get back to basics in the region. And part of that is the kind of the exchanges with the next generation of civil society leaders and political leaders. And that's something that Korea was doing 20 years ago. So it's not new, but in my view, it's lost its way along that process for 3 or 4 specific reasons I'll turn to now. So one of the big issues, of course, is this question of European populism. So that whole debate about Korea joining NATO as a Euro-Atlantic organization assumes that Europe and the US are on the same page. It's a rules-based order. It's a value-based order. It's like-minded states. In my view, that's all, well, not gone, but it's certainly now very much been eroded. So right across Western Europe, and interestingly, many parts of Eastern Europe as well. So, after the Cold War, Eastern Europe states were very much pushing for integration to the European Union, part of Europe, promoting democracy. They wanted to be very quickly part of NATO. Of course, this is the question about Ukraine going back to 1991. So actually, the Eastern Europe, the former Soviet bloc, was much more pro-NATO, much more pro-EU. And now we are seeing a reversal of that. So in many NATO countries, France and Hungary, I think, probably stand out on this. We're getting this rise, this surge of populism. For many, many different reasons. I can't go into all the reasons for that. Some of them are self-explanatory, but the implication is that this populism is very much part of a movement of anti-multilateralism. Whether that's isolationism, I'm not sure. Whether it's unilateralism, we're not sure yet, but certainly anti-multilateralism. And the link has been made between multilateralism and what these populists see as a kind of liberal elite. So liberal values, all that kind of work that was done for 50, 60, 70 years in the European Union and elsewhere is now seen as a threat by many populists to the people, as they call, and democracy. They have a very different version of democracy. So the challenge in Europe, certainly, and perhaps in the US, but for different reasons, is this anti-liberal, anti-elite. And of course, the irony being that all these populists are and started off as liberal and elite. These are very, very wealthy and well-connected politicians. But that doesn't seem to matter to their supporters, who don't tend to notice contradictions and paradoxes. But it's certainly very much a movement. This idea of basically shutting down multilateral organizations. In my own country, with Brexit, essentially that is cutting off ties with the rest of the world. So Britain literally becomes another archipelago island. That's a lot of what many groups and pro-Brexit and far-right groups in Britain want. And there's this movement at the moment called Reform UK, which people are saying is a new movement. It's not. The people involved with Reform have been around since the late 70s. There's a very strong cultural and historical heritage for these people on the far right. They just wear suits now and ties and pretend they care. But that's a specific British issue. But those kind of ideas are floating around Europe now. Now, of course, the implication for NATO is very clear. That if these groups get into power, then institutions like NATO and European Union basically fall apart. But they have no interest in financing and funding these institutions. They see these institutions as part of a liberal elite, and they are very angry for whatever reason. They are very angry and weaponize that anger to get the support. So it's a very strange form. I wouldn't even call it nationalism. I would call it populism. It's a very strange kind of movement. And what's interesting is, as I mentioned earlier, is that what it's doing is seem to be reshaping what we mean by left wing and right wing. So again, to use the example in my country, I kind of see the correlation or similarities in Korea and Britain. A lot of kind of Labour socialists from 1970s, 1980s are now signing up to this populist right-wing agenda. Okay, so I think that's a pattern we're seeing in many parts of the world, the rise of populism. And that's going to have a big impact on organizations like NATO and the European Union. And the concern, of course, is certainly from a NATO perspective, is NATO is made up both of European Union and non-European Union European members. Britain and France, Britain and Turkey, rather, are very much part of that group. And of course, you have US and Canada as well. So there were talks about a few weeks ago of creating a specific European Union security alliance, which implies that organizations like NATO will no longer be that powerful anymore, certainly if the United States decides to leave. So Canada actually plays a big part in this and a big role in this now. So there's kind of very interesting linkages in a diplomacy now between Britain and Turkey, Britain and Canada. And actually Iceland also plays a role in this. Iceland is a non-EU member, but a member of NATO. And of course, this impacts the role of Greenland, which the Trump administration is focusing on. And of course, the tragedy of this is that Greenland essentially is a part of Denmark. Denmark is very much a part of its whole defense mechanism. So again, America is threatening its own institution. It's a very, very strange perspective. So this is something that I'll turn to in a moment, these different dynamics. One thing I do want to mention, though, is in introduction, Ukraine question. Of course, we can't ignore that about what the Ukraine question implies. But the relevance for Korea is this: that there was a Zoom meeting or online speech by Zelensky about two or 3 years ago to the Korean National Congress in Yeouido, where I think the Philippine guests are visiting next week. And not many congressmen and women turned up to this meeting, which is very strange because you'd think there'd be lots of people there, quite a few no-shows. And the concern for many was that if Korea shows solidarity with Ukraine, then that's going to provoke Russia. Russia called Korea, following this kind of showing of support for Zelensky in Ukraine. It was reported that Russia called Korea, the unfriendliest of our friendly nations. Okay, so not an enemy, not a threat, but very clearly not happy with what Korea is doing here. And of course, North Korea, enjoyed that a lot. North Korea has actually been very quiet recently, so it's obviously calculating where its interests lie. But a lot of concerns that Korea was again getting trapped into the Ukraine war when it needs Russian help, it needs Russian support for access to resources, the old Arctic routes, the high North routes. Geographically, Russia is very, very close to Korea, and this is what many Europeans tend to forget. I saw an interesting social media post the other day. I think it was actually Elon Musk who posted, had to remind Americans that actually America is very close to Russia too. And a lot of the MAGA supporters and American supporters, no, it's not. Well, Alaska is quite close to Russia with the Diomede Islands down the Bering Strait. So this idea of geography still plays a big part. We can't ignore the physical geography of this. And many congressmen and women were concerned that, Korea is provoking Russia, and it doesn't need to do this. It doesn't have to do this. Why is Korea doing this? Other countries would understand that Korea just focuses on the Korean Peninsula issues rather than getting involved with Russia. But on the other hand, there is an argument to say that what Ukraine has done is to open out this whole idea of regional identity. So, of course, Russia's big argument is that Ukraine has always been a part of Russia. In 1991, Ukraine was separated from Russia as part of the old Soviet Union. There's a Russian Orthodox Church. It's in the history of all this. Ukraine is basically a Western country, a figment of the Western imagination to provoke Russia on Russia's borders. All that debate about Ukraine requires denazification by the Soviet Union and by Russia, rather. This is Putin's big argument. There's this argument about whether Russia really wanted to conquer Ukraine or take over Ukraine, or whether it was just happy kind of taking bits of Ukraine and creating a disruption strategy and provoking the West. We don't know clearly the intentions, but the implications for Korea are quite big, and for Taiwan as well, because what Ukraine has done is to open up this issue of regional politics and regional history, about questions of absorption, because that essentially is what Korean unification can be all about: absorption of one Korea by another Korea, in the same way that Russia is absorbing parts of Ukraine and Crimea, and the same with Taiwan. But China has had a policy towards Taiwan of absorption and also of isolation. It goes backwards and forwards. So the Ukraine issue is almost a metaphor, if you like, for what's happening in the Asia Pacific. There's politics of absorptions. For that reason alone, a lot of people say that Korea needs to be involved, and Ukraine needs to learn and understand what great powers do and how they work. And the only way to do that is to be involved with organizations like NATO and get access to that information. And this is very much part of the Yoon administration's policies, to join NATO, to get access to information. Korea joined the nuclear consultation group with Japan and the US, with the Washington Declaration 2023. Korea is heavily involved in cybersecurity operations. So that kind of plugging in to the network does feedback to the region. But this idea of regional chronology and the history becomes very much a part of this, about who controls the history, who manages and has power to define what legitimate regional history is. So Ukraine, Taiwan, and Korea, this absorption question becomes, and a territorial question becomes very, very, a powerful issue. And I think that's what the Ukraine situation brought up, the way that the great powers are able to use history in order to justify and legitimate what, in terms of international politics, is basically territorial annexation. Okay, so maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. As I mentioned, this is the kind of Europeanized NATO idea. So if Korea, or rather if the United States does decide to leave NATO, if there's a populist movement in Europe and the European Union, and the governments of European members want to leave NATO, then this leaves Korea in a very difficult position, because Korea has actually not just joined NATO as a partner, but has actually created its own organizations within NATO. The big one for me is the Asia Pacific Four, or what we call the Indo-Pacific Four now, of Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. So this is where Korea essentially joins as a bridge nation, a bridge state. We have debates now whether, if NATO does disband or does become more Euro-Atlantic and wants to pull back a little bit from the Indo-Pacific, then maybe you see the AP4 evolving as an Asian NATO. Then the question about the resource question. So again, this is very, very much up for debate. There's no resolution of this at the moment, but and again, maybe we'll talk about this later. But I see this as a major issue for redefining the region, about Asian NATO, AP4, and the relationship between those. So there's a number of implications for Korea's NATO partnering. The first one, I've kind of covered a little bit already, about the US alliance. Okay, so is this partnering really strengthening the US alliance? Or actually, would it be better for Korea to leave NATO, to not supply NATO anymore with resources, to use those resources back in Korea? And if Korea is able to do that, can say to the United States, look, we are paying for our defense, so you can be okay with us. You don't need to be cross or angry with us. We are paying our way for our security, therefore you can help us. So this is the argument to say that if Korea becomes much more regionally based, that is how a better relationship with the US is maintained, rather than continuing supplying resources to NATO, which in a few months or a few years' time might not even be a United States organization anyway. So that's one issue regarding the question of resources. The second question, again, I've covered a little bit regarding Korea's reputation. Korea has been involved in Chip 4, as I mentioned, with the United States, but my view is that reputation is now being questioned within NATO, and Korea needs to get back to basics and rebuild its reputation within the Asia Pacific, because in my view, the way Trump is going now and talking about the rare earth issue and the Arctic issue with Greenland, his eyes will turn to North Korea. He wants his Nobel Prize. He wants his peace between the two Koreas. And various interests in the US want North Korean rare earths as well. So that will be very much a part of a potential deal between North Korea and the US, and that could very much isolate South Korea. Trump might see South Korea as an annoyance. So South Korea really needs to show the Americans that they want American support, and that's another question. They assume making an assumption, but maybe a bit more self-sufficiency. And bringing those resources back to South Korea could be quite useful, because of course what North Korea has done is, with its ability now to hit the American mainland directly, there's that old adage we hear a lot in Korean politics, that is America really ready to sacrifice San Francisco for Seoul, if it really came to that? And certainly under a Trump administration, the argument would be, well, Trump doesn't like California and San Francisco very much, but he wouldn't be willing to sacrifice any American city for Seoul. And that makes South Korea very, very vulnerable. So this is a kind of moving towards the argument about whether South Korea perhaps would need now its own nuclear deterrence in this kind of uncertain environment. So again, yes, so this is the point I raised here regarding the AP4, the Asian NATO question. I kind of covered this already. So this is the final point I want to make here regarding the nuclear question. So this is a debate that's been raging for years within Korea about the advantages and disadvantages of whether Korea is quite happy to have United States security umbrella, which itself has nuclear weapons. This kind of goes back to the early 90s nuclearization of the umbrella. The nuclear weapons were taken away from the Korean Peninsula in 1991, 92 after the Cold War, so it wasn't particularly a major surprise. And then you have the idea, well, you know, it's a nuclear deterrence. That's a very useful device to have. In order to deter any North Korean attack. Now, in traditional international relations, this would be seen as very much a big problem. To have middle power states in the region having their own nuclear weapons, that inevitably will create an arms race between the US allies in the region. And traditionally, US or big power has wanted to avoid that. A Trump administration, a populist administration, may not be too concerned about that. Okay, if Korea wants its nuclear weapon, let Korea have its nuclear weapon. Trump would be basing that argument on what happened in Iraq, in Libya, and the war of terror 20 years ago, where if countries want nuclear weapons, they will get nuclear weapons. In fact, it's trying to stop countries having nuclear weapons. That's what causes the difficulties and the conflicts. Of course, what that would mean for Korea would be that Korea would leave the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that would put Korea very much next to North Korea. Okay, so it wouldn't so much become a rogue state, but its reputation would be very, very severely hit if Korea does go this path. And I've had a discussion with colleagues about one of the arguments is, well, don't worry, you know, everybody would understand South Korea. Everyone loves South Korea. Everyone likes K-pop, K-food, and Samsung smartphones. So they would understand Korea having a nuclear weapon. I'm more skeptical about arguments when it comes to countries' national security. I think they would be very bothered by that. And of course, the other thing, one of the criticisms of Korea being involved with NATO is that Korea is not protected by Article 5, which is NATO's collective security guarantee to each member. But if one member is attacked, then it's an attack on all members. The irony of Article 5 is there's only one time that Article 5 has been released, and that was in the aftermath of 9/11, war on terror in the United States. And of course, the war on terror, the 9/11, was not an attack by a state. It was attacked by a non-state actor. So this is why many are looking at NATO and looking at issues of cybersecurity, but the real threats essentially come from individuals, cybersecurity. That's where Korea has learned from NATO on that, but maybe it's learned enough and maybe time to get back to the region for its own interests on this and not overstretch these resources. And again, this is another Trump issue, but a lot of people are very critical of Trump and Vance's comments about Europe, about the sacrifice of European NATO members laid in Afghanistan and Iraq and so on. And you know, the United States doesn't understand the importance of these alliances. And you can't just dismiss it by saying, as Vance did, oh, is it 20 years ago? Yes, it could be 100 years ago, it could be 50 years ago. It's not the point. The point is that these sacrifices were made. So again, it may be rhetoric. It may be just basic ignorance, we don't know. But these alliances do matter. People do remember, and history is very much a part of that, and can't be just dismissed so quickly. So that's evoking quite a strong reaction in Europe. So, a lot of European Union members of NATO are now saying, well, look, if America wants to leave NATO, good. We don't want this American administration in NATO. And that's so the MAGA and the Trump administration has been a little bit counterproductive here. It's quite arrogant to think that everyone wants the Americans in these institutions in the first place. So these are kind of domestic shifts in Korea. I mentioned the conservatives, the liberals, issues of Japan and North Korea. I mentioned the MAGA question here. We don't know, essentially, but in terms of the trends and the patterns we will see now, certainly from my perspective as a European and a kind of sort of British perspective on this, and certainly from a Korean perspective, it's very clear the pattern towards populism, the pattern towards these leaders who are quite willing to rewrite history, whether for personal reasons or for political reasons. And this idea that Korea is involved with other regions, I think that's rather a luxury now. Okay, that's almost, it sounds very nostalgic. It's another world. Things have changed so quickly since November. So my view is, in terms of my conclusion, is that it's essentially time for Korea to get back to basics as a middle power, to focus perhaps on the Russian relations now. Access to the Arctic North is going to be a big issue for Korea in terms of trade, travel, and also access to minerals as well. China and North Korea have been very quiet. Well, certainly North Korea, China not so much over the last 48 hours over the tariff issue. But again, my view is that this is an opportunity because, of course, in domestic Korean politics, it's very, very polarized at the moment. The center ground is very small in Korea, but it's going to play a big part in the election in 2 months' time. As I mentioned, 2022 election, President Yoon won the election by what, 0.5%? It wasn't even 1%. These things are very tight and probably even tighter now. So it might not be a surprise if the winner of the presidential election in a few months' time wins by 0.2%. On the one hand, that's good because that shows democracy in action, but also it might generate legitimacy problems as well to have such a slender margin. So on that basis, you can perhaps see a space opening up here for progressives on Japan, on China, on North Korea. In my view, there's kind of room for maneuver a little bit for progressives to move towards Japan, not so strongly as the conservatives, but there was this, I think I mentioned actually last time I spoke to this group back in September, this kind of populism, nationalism within the conservative movement in Korea and under Yoon's leadership, the populism, the younger generation, the male gender issue coming through. That's one aspect of this, but a clever progressive presidential candidate may see an opportunity here because, in my view, strategically, relations now between China, Japan, and Korea are going to define the Indo-Pacific, or rather Asia-Pacific, and Indian relations with Japan have been very, very strong because of the history, and Korea relations with India and right through to Southeast Asia, that whole Asia-Pacific connection, which I think Korea has rather forgotten about these last few years, needs to get back to basics and needs to get back on board. And my view is if that's to leave NATO or to reduce interest in NATO, now would be the time to do it, because the NATO that Korea knew and joined 20 years ago, and European members who joined, and Korea's relationship with European members and the US, those relationships have now, in my view, profoundly changed. And that's opportunity, and I think that's also an opportunity for more pragmatism as well in Korean foreign policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Watson. I think I should say that at least two very important things I saw in your presentation. One is that's very, very comprehensive. And two, that is very, very convincing. You covered all possible aspects. And basically, you did very, good justice to the topic.
Yeah.
I think I'm also quite having similar opinion. Mm-hmm. And if I have to summarize your lecture today, I would say that you are making 2-3 important points. One is you are saying that, look, rule-based multilateral order in threat, but threats are coming from different directions. it's not only Ukraine crisis where the threat for this US-led rule-based multilateral order actually which emerged or which got sustained. In recent years, many of those threats, they are coming from even behavior of United States itself. That's one, that rule-based order we need to understand that even though you can call it US-led rule-based order, even the people who are part of making of this order, they may not be necessarily savior of this order. They may be actually deviating from their path, and that must be understood. That's one. The second part you try to say that when South Korea wants to support NATO and coming more, actually, when I was before your lecture, I was trying to have some understanding of this topic. So I came across a few articles saying that from 2005-6 itself, US, like South Korea started having more, can say, context with NATO.
Yes.
And there were several mechanisms through which both entities, they were cooperating with each other. And those cooperations were important for South Korea. They were good for national interests. But the way 2022, Yoon Suk-yeol presidency, it brought everything into, you can say bold, so-called bold foreign policy moves, or say very assertive and rather. Actually, I personally also feel that making a clear-cut foreign policy is not an achievement. I think foreign policy is meant, sometimes it may be, you can say, to others looking less clear, but pursuing national interests. So I fully agree with you that you said that South Korea, when they are going to NATO and supporting that, they are not necessarily doing justice to so-called multilateral rule-based order. And secondly, in the same second topic, actually, B, that basically not aware about South Korean soft power, South Korean geographical location, South Korean priorities. Even if the, you can say, the goals of America and South Korea could be same, but priorities may be different. So I think probably previous administration of South Korea were not able to take out all these issues together. And that's also my observation is that former President Yoon Suk-yeol, he had less understanding of granularity of international relations.
Yes.
He was much more, you can say, making broad brush painting everywhere and making bold statements saying that I'm ready to, like South Korea is ready to become part of Quad country. Then I think Americans, they are saying that, no, we are not going to invite you. Kind of, can say, so those, I think, situations were not serving national interest of South Korea. And probably for that, you probably recommended in your presentation.
Yes, absolutely.
South Korea goes back to basics. They need to understand that they have different, you can say, core competences, and they should work on that. And accordingly, driven by their national interest, they should take this issue of saving rule-based multilateral order rather than blindly putting all eggs into one basket or something like that.
Yes.
So it was very learning for me. So now I will open this for question answer. I have one question. I will ask in the later part. So the floor is open for questions. Anybody? Anybody? Should I ask my own question before the others they articulate? Actually, many scholars, they have been also pointing towards what happened post 2020 actually. What happened that actually South Korea became a very, very important, and I think Yoon Suk-yeol, he when he adopted this policy, very overt move to go close to NATO. One of the reasons they said that was basically looking for market for Korean arms export.
Right.
Because actually in 2022, he had 12 billion US dollar deal with Poland. Last year also, they had some, I think, almost $1 billion with Romania. And I think last year, there was some speculation that Romania may buy 14 billion US dollar worth from Korea. So how the new president is going to go to basics at the same time pursue these important lucrative opportunity for South
Yes.
Korean arms export to this region?
Yes. Yes. Okay, so I just I'll answer that in a moment. So thank you for your question, but a few points you raised in your discussion about, I mean, that idea that Yoon saw the world very much as kind of block. That's the bad block and that's the good block, and we need to be in the Indo-Pacific block as a rules base. So there was no that the Moon Jae-in administration talked about strategic ambiguity, and there wasn't much ambiguity in Yoon's work and policy. And again, I think that's part of the Korean presidential system, that Yoon wanted immediately to legitimate himself. And usually Korean presidents have about 2 years before they hit a kind of lame duck period, because they know they're going to be out of office. They never have to run for office again. So it's kind of political system as an issue there as well. And I think just to be different from Moon Jae-in, he completely went the opposite way. So we see in Korean foreign policy that very backwards and forwards, just to distance from a previous administration. So that's sometimes used as an explanation for Yoon. But I would tend to view how you've seen this, that this is basically Yoon saying we need to see the world back as pro-US, anti-Russia, anti-China, and therefore to show that, I need to show the Biden administration, Washington, that we are with you in terms of a US ally. Very, very black and white. And the problem was, of course, that lack of ambiguity undid some of the good that Korea's done over the years in terms of trying to navigate this kind of very complex region for Korea. Korea was involved in NATO, it's involved in the G7. So a lot of the literature and the Quad and AUKUS, so a lot of the literature basically adds it all up. So that the phrase, putting eggs in one basket, absolutely. So that's the phrase I've used as well. So everything goes here and you just use it up and build up and build up and build up. But there was no critical reflection about what Korea was giving away here. Okay, so a lot of the literature, middle power, autonomy, some literature even began to talk about Korea being a great power, a great regional power in the region. That kind of ambition or that kind of rhetoric can be very, very counterproductive. And there was that famous sort of filming of Yoon singing in the White House. So Yoon's conservatives loved all that, the kind of the American Pie thing, all that kind of business. For me, that was just so ridiculously counterproductive, because everyone could see, even domestic American politics, you could see, but the next election, 2024 in America, is going to be very, very tight. So he's really got to hedge a little bit here. So that hedging, that kind of balancing, that kind of classic Korean diplomacy, Yoon, in my view, just gave it away. So it needs to be regained again. But in my view, I mean, we're making assumptions that a progressive will win a presidency in 2 months' time. It's people are saying, but politics is a funny game. But if there is a progressive administration, that kind of era when Korea joined NATO in 2005, that era is now gone. So you might find that the progressives take on a little bit of the conservative ideas and kind of mix them up a little bit. So again, that ambiguity. If you have a foreign policy that's ambiguous, then you don't end up with hypocrisy and contradictions, because by definition it's ambiguous. So there was always that pressure in the Yoon administration, but he talked about value bases and so on. Of course, a lot of people were saying, well, this is a bit hypocritical given some of the allies that Korea has. And that's actually a middle power issue, because some of the work I'm working on at the moment with Canada and Australia, which are, traditional middle power, good citizens, everybody likes Australia, everybody likes Canada. But if you think about their domestic politics in Australia in terms of Aboriginal land rights, immigration, asylum centres, this is quite brutal stuff by the Australian government. So in international politics, Australia is the friend, and it's happy and it's all that kind of soft power image. But actually, domestic politics is actually quite illiberal and quite problematic. So this is something that we forget when we talk about middle powers. We forget about the other side in terms of domestic politics. So the point you raise about the military equipment, yeah, that's very, and presumably there are some deals and obligations that Korea has, contracts signed, that Korea still has to deliver and supply on all this. It's good for the Korean economy. A lot of people were saying, yeah, this is great for opening up trade of European Union. It's opening up trade with NATO members. There's a kind of the like-minded, the peer issue there. Eastern Europe was a big one. Poland was the first big one for Korea, providing for Poland. So presumably there'll be some carry on for the kind of obligations that Korea has. But in my view, Korea has only had to do that because it's moved away from the region. Okay, there's enough in the region with China and high middle income countries coming through now in terms of Korea's economy. So, Korea now, that kind of, the point I made about resource dependency, that kind of policy has put Korea in a very difficult position. But my view is once those contracts are signed and things are delivered, then it's time for Korea to reset and to think more about focusing more in the region in terms of economic trade and that kind of thing, which again, there's opportunity here. But if Trump is going to start playing a tariff game, then countries are going to recalibrate and start maybe free trading amongst themselves. So maybe there will be some deals with the European Union, trade deals, but they don't need to be linked to military aid or military equipment. They're just simply trade deals. So, that's something that links to part of a changing dynamic now with Europe. But again, I come back to the point, and again, it's back to basics point that Korea's position is in the Asia Pacific. Okay, that cannot be ignored. And these organizations, even the G20, which is I haven't heard much from the G20 recently over the tariff issue. WTO has been very quiet. So this whole global multilateral era is starting to kind of unravel a little bit. So there's a little literature coming through now, which I'm very sympathetic to, is that literally Korea delinkles and decouples from this kind of global multilateral era and starts to think about rebuilding regional organizations, which don't have to be anti-US or anti-liberal, just an alternative. And of course, the irony of that is this is exactly what China was starting to do about 10 or 15 years ago. So that's something that I think might happen this year or the next couple of years, that China, once we got over this kind of tariff, 200% thing with tariffs, China's going to look at South Korea, look at Japan. There'll be a realignment a little bit of those relationships. And Korea needs to be ready for that and preparing for that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think there's a question from Ambassador Ranjini.
Yeah.
Ambassador, would you like to ask yourself, or should I read it?
Could you just read it? Because my connection is not that good.
Okay. So he's asking a slightly different question, but related question. Sure. He's asking that what is the position of South Korea on question of Taiwan, knowing that China is its largest partner, and at the same time it needs of security guarantee of the United States and special relations it wants with NATO.
Yes. I mean, at the moment, well, certainly during the Yoon administration, Korea was very, very much part and linked to Taiwan, particularly economically. So there's an economic side to it and a geopolitical side to it. So economically, there was a semiconductor issue, the Chip 4 between Taiwan, Japan, and the United States. That was a very interesting development, the supply chain element. So Samsung were involved in that, quite interested in that. And that was seen again as part of this Indo-Pacific bloc, something that China actually, reports coming through, that China is very concerned about. So Chip 4 was seen as Taiwan essentially isolating itself from China and putting so the geoeconomics inevitably becomes geopolitical. And of course, Taiwan at the time was getting a lot of security guarantees from the United States. So the Trump administration, if you see Chip 4 as linking US, Korea, Taiwan, and Japan together, and you see the United States pulling away from Taiwan, then Taiwan now is very, very vulnerable to China. And there's an argument to say that it's almost inevitable. I can't remember where I saw it. I think it was an interview somewhere with one of Trump's people, actually. I actually think it was John Bolton, of all people. But he was talking about that China is looking to absorb Taiwan, not yet, but within 10 years. I have a kind of dateline for this. So again, Korea's role in the Asia Pacific, it could go back to a kind of classic bridging role. But if Korea has a much better relationship with China and builds that relationship with China now, that could be very useful to secure Taiwan in terms of economics and also geopolitics as well. So the United States basically talks itself out of influence in the Asia Pacific. Now, a lot of people would be very happy with that. but the United States is the country causing all the problems and difficulties. But on the other hand, there's a more conservative argument to say that the United States has to stay here to guarantee Taiwan's security. The problem for South Korea is that if the US does stay in the region and the US is looking at Japan and Korea, and Japan and Korea are not providing the US with resources or sharing the costs, but the United States might say, okay, we will protect Taiwan, but we'll let all the rest of you go. So my view is that that trajectory of the Taiwan question comes from what happens to Chip 4 and how the US and China are looking at the whole semiconductor issue between Japan and Korea and Taiwan, and also what Korea does as well. So Korea, in my view, again, part of that pattern needs to get back here very, very quickly and start to think about these regional organizations. But I think a general view, again, as another person talked about the Taiwan question, I think the general view at the moment is that Taiwan is now incredibly vulnerable and has gone very, very quiet. And again, we don't know how it's going to play out. So one of the interesting things is that many European nations now, so it works the other way as well, but there's Korea in NATO and Euro-Atlantic, but also many NATO members and European Union members are also now have their own Indo-Pacific strategies. Germany, France, Britain, Canada does as well. So they're very sensitive to the history of European powers in the Asia-Pacific. The comprehensive trade agreement, which Britain joined last year. So there is interest. So what we're beginning to see a little bit is Taiwan is now looking at support from Europe rather than from the United States. So AUKUS plays a part in that. The French are very interested now in the region. So that's how it might play out. The problem about it, of course, is but if you have the populists getting into power in Europe, then they won't want anything to do with Taiwan. So at the moment, China is being very quiet. It's watching what's happening. But the Ukraine issue, this is one of the arguments put forward about Ukraine issue and how South Korea and how America responds to Ukraine. China is learning from that. It's learning from Russian mistakes. It's almost, maybe that's one of the reasons some would say why China wasn't supporting Russia so much over Ukraine. It's not because China doesn't necessarily want to support Russia, but it's wanting to see the kind of errors that Russia makes, the kind of mistakes. Let it make all these mistakes. We can learn from those mistakes when it comes to our decision on Taiwan in about 10 years' time. So there's a kind of connection there. But again, in my view, the big issue is the Chip 4 and the linking between economics and geopolitics on this.
So did you cover that what South Korea should do?
What South Korea should do, continue economic cooperation. Well, for Taiwan or for South Korea. Okay, so in terms of South Korean interests, the big interests there are the semiconductors. It needs Taiwan. It needs that economic trade, that economic relationship, and it's very much locked into that. That's one of the problems of this lack of strategic ambiguity. So for South Korea's own national interests and economic interests, it needs to continue that relationship with Taiwan and Japan as well. So that's why I mentioned that Japan is really any progressive government coming in May or June needs to open up with Japan much more for that reason, to keep that kind of trilateralism going. In terms of Taiwan's own self-interests, they're in terms of their self-interest in economics is Chip 4. In terms of their security, clearly they're going to be watching what Trump is doing, and once all this tariff stuff has calmed down, may go to Trump with some kind of deal, maybe travel to Washington, who knows. But in terms of South Korean national interest, it's all about Chip 4 and semiconductors. South Korea is very vulnerable at the moment to semiconductors. If China and America get into a trade war, Korea actually closed down a lot of factories in China and moved them to Southeast Asia a couple of years ago on the assumption that we don't need China because we've got the United States. That was a very short-sighted policy. So a lot of supply chains were impacted by that. So in terms of Taiwan, for Korea's national economic interest, it needs to have a much closer relationship with Taiwan, but do it in that ambiguous way. It's not a pro-US way, not an anti-US way. It's in a South Korean national interest way. And that's what I think Korea has lost. It's defined its national interests through the United States, and it needs to get back to basics and get away from that.
Yeah, a very interesting question has come from Manuel F. Vidal Garrido. He asked you that, do you think that US is wrong to choose between US and China? Is it possible to be a neutral position, especially for Asian country, like countries of Southeast Asia and East Asia. Is it possible for them to become
Okay,
neutral and remain neutral?
That's a great question, because that really gets to the heart of where middle powers are in the region. So I would say when relations between US and China are relatively good or stable, then that's an opportunity for middle powers to become more, the word we use a lot is autonomous, more independent. It doesn't have to choose sides. It doesn't have to hedge. It doesn't have to bandwagon. And therefore, it can be more multilateral, create more organizations. And this is exactly what Korea did. It fits perfectly to 2005, 2006. But China was rising. China wanted a stable geopolitical environment. China was very cross with North Korea for creating this instability. And of course, that's why North Korea did this for its own national security. When you get two conflicting superpowers or regional powers conflicting, then usually small states or middle power states cannot remain neutral for very long. At some point, they have to choose. Now, Korea has been able to kind of manage a little bit and delay these decisions and kind of be more multilateral and open up more options. Indeed, that's why Korea joined NATO. That's the original idea, was to open up more options. The problem is Korea's NATO role has closed down those options by making it very much a pro-US approach. So yes, I mean, the word neutral itself is subject to some kind of different interpretations, but I would say when US and China are not cooperating but stable and they need each other but depend on each other, then absolutely. I think probably a word neutral or maybe non-aligned or unofficially non-aligned. And that's why Korea is very active regionally. But there is this argument now, absolutely, yes, that as the US and China look as though they're going to some kind of economic conflict over tariffs, but at some point, Korea is going to have to make some kind of choice. What's interesting, and one of the arguments that Trump has kind of miscalculated this, is that Trump has basically annoyed most of the world in terms of these tariffs. So paradoxically, this gives actually give Korea more options now, because everybody understands Korea's situation, because they're in the same situation. So that actually generates more opportunity for middle powers, even smaller powers, to cooperate much more now. So, if that's what Trump's objective was, to kind of generate more solidarity and a kind of more independence, and not be so costly for the US, then so be it. But clearly for the US, that could be very, very isolating, especially as China now can, China can use the same argument. So countries in East Asia, China can say, look, you had the tariffs, you were threatened, we were threatened, we're all in the same boat. So one argument is that the US has basically given the entire region to China. And of course, that's an issue for Taiwan. That's the one country would be really concerned about this. So again, that's a kind of another dynamic to this, which is why, as I mentioned, America and Taiwan's relationship might become stronger because of these different dynamics. So yeah, that's kind of the kind of the delaying. So I would say yes, but at the moment there seems to be a move that maybe Korea is going to have to make a decision, and of course that does impact on Korean domestic politics, which is why you're going to see a realignment of conservative and progressive, I think, because of this external environment at the moment. Thank you for the question.
One small supplementary question to this very good question is that do you feel that what are the problems of articulation of what I call actually third way, in the sense when US and China, they are presenting two models and saying that either you accept this one or that one. And when their rivalry is becoming more intense, as you said, that countries of Southeast Asia, East Asia, and even South Asia, they have no choice but to take side. So why can't these different countries, which are good in number, including India, we can articulate a third way? What are the problems in articulation of the third way, which could say that, look, your challenge is your challenge. We are going to have much more developmental and futuristic agenda, and we will not join your contest. Something like
that. I would say absolutely. I think one of the ironies here is that this is exactly the outcome of US foreign policy at the moment, but it's making this happen. Okay, it's creating this third way. It's creating this kind of non-aligned countries who don't have to go pro-US or pro-China now. So you've seen a very strange dynamic, but the US is basically doing this itself, which is not meant to happen in international relations theory, because IR theory, for instance, says exactly what you're saying about this non-alignment, about neutrality, about choices, and why can't countries come together and create an alternative to this challenge between the US and China. So I would say in the context of recently, Russia and India would have played so Russia would have played a part, but India can play a big part in this. I mean, that's why a lot of interest now in Korea-India relations, Japan-India relations, which is a very, very long history. And of course, the Indian Ocean, that whole maritime space, is a very big issue now, and for European countries as well, to Seychelles and Mauritius and the Chagos Island issue, Madagascar and Sri Lanka. So that's kind of the area now. So yes, absolutely. There's when I actually wrote about some of this geopolitics, and when I looked at Korean ODA and foreign aid, is a very strong part of this. But there's a kind of third option here. There's another kind of dimension here. And I think there's usually that argument says, okay, well, these states now have somehow got to come together. They've got to find areas of mutual interest. They're non-aligned. The non-aligned movement has a very, very long history in international politics. And that's always very difficult because there's always that pressure that the superpowers, for instance, the US would put pressure on Japan and Korea. No, you've got to come with us, kind of hugging, locking in. That would be the traditional limit to that idea of being neutral. But now you have a US which is saying the opposite. Okay, we're not going to hug you in. You just go away. If you want to be non-aligned, you be non-aligned. We don't want anything to do with you. So that kind of process, actually, I would say, is actually more positive for the possibility of creating that kind of third dimension on this. And the US is doing it to itself. Okay, and this is a fascinating issue, and that's why a lot of the kind of hegemonic theorists and all these people look at the great powers. That they're looking at the puzzle exactly what you and the questioner were saying here about this hedging, about staying neutral. But the terms of that debate itself, I would say, are now changing, because the hegemonic state is not meant to say, okay, if you don't want you anywhere near us, we need to keep away from us. That's very unusual. So maybe opportunity, definitely in that process, absolutely.
Any other question?
One person raised here.
Yes, Mr. Moderator, my student has been raising his hand for quite some time.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Ulysses.
Ulysses, ask your question now, please. Ulysses. Masyado na nagtatagal to.
She was waiting for a long time.
Oh my goodness, I did not see. Sorry. Okay, Mikio, before that, Professor Mikio, is he? Yes.
Okay,
you can ask.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sandeep and
Yes.
Dr. Watson. Thank you very much for your very wonderful and very, very balanced presentation. To be frank, I have been more anti-US for China, but I like your position, very neutral. And just now you said Donald Trump can open up the new potential, right? For
unintentionally.
Yeah. And I like that that prospect very much. And basically now also, as far as I know, also Japan kind of slowly shifting position from US now. And of course, you mentioned and foreign ministers of China, Japan, South Korea talk each other, right? And this is something interesting.
It's happening, yeah.
Yeah, actually. And also I understand Trump is this is Trump revolution. Some people say Trump revolution. Revolution is destroying, foremost, destroying of the current order, maybe even the so-called rule-based international order. He's also destroying, actually. Then what will come out after this one, maybe. So because I have been living in the developing country, so-called global south, for quite some time, so I have been very much familiar with maybe the aspirations and the positions of the global south countries. So basically the rule-based order is considered as a kind of the neocolonialism, neocolonial rule.
Yes.
So I think that bringing about change to rule-based order, I think seems to be rather positive.
I see. Yes.
Positive. And also the many people in global south, I think, look at the so-called Russian invasion in Ukraine. Maybe from this perspective, Russia can open up the new possibility And because of a lot of things open up now, and Russia has become the kind of the leader of the global South countries, and of course Russia offered economic support, food support to African countries and other things. But I feel we need to maybe come up with a maybe totally different, maybe how they say, perspective, not how they say. Because if you look back on the history of East Asia, I think also we may get some hint, I think, from the past history, but maybe it is maybe too old. So maybe in the history of the East Asia, for certain times there's a war, and especially Japan invaded South Korea, Korean Peninsula. But after that, there's a certain regional and peace, right? And during Tokugawa shogunate period. So I think now I feel, and in East Asia, and definitely the crisis now, and for the short term, many people, many countries suffer economically, but maybe for the long term, maybe this can be maybe process towards creating a new regional order that is not necessarily based on the Western idea, but more Asian ideas. Maybe I'd like to hear from you, maybe your idea. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, that's a very, very interesting point. That I would actually link that back to the formation of the BRIC organization about 20 years ago now, with Russia and China were kind of the forefront and seemed to be kind of heroes of the global South, creating a kind of new kind of multilateral order. And that was always Russia and China's complaint, that the order of the United Nations or any other kind of the rules-based order, whose rules, whose values are we talking about here? So I would say, yes, that is something that we can take from this, that there's enough kind of momentum in the global South to see this as an opportunity. However, I don't want to underestimate that the challenges to the rules-based order, certainly in Europe and certainly in the United States, are coming from groups and organizations and politics which is not progressive and would have no sympathy whatsoever for the global South. So these are kind of very nationalist, very populist groups. So there is that opportunity to create a progressive rules-based order. And the global South has been talking about this at the various conferences, and the G20 was a kind of the first sign of inviting, and the African Union is now as a member of the G20s. That's very much a part of this. So I very much take that argument, and in terms of even reforming the organizations. And Russia and China have always said that they are the only countries that really keep the United Nations going. So it's kind of strange paradox that the more conservative and the more establishment China and Russia are, at the same time, the more radical they are as well, because they challenge the kind of the US and the kind of European approach to this. But I would agree with you to an extent, but also worry that the challenges to this order and the space that's opening out is not coming from progressive forces. Whether the global South can use this, and I think that's absolutely a possibility. As I mentioned earlier, the third way idea, there's a moment here of opportunity, and I would absolutely agree with that. But the reason why these opportunities are happening is not because these groups or states or countries or political parties want to help the global South, probably actually on the contrary. But there is an issue of as I mentioned, the sensitivity to the European Indo-Pacific strategy people who are looking at Asia-Pacific. And they realize the historical legacy, the colonial legacy, they're very sensitive to that. And they're aware of the difficulties of what the European interventions have. And of course, the paradox is, for the populists in Europe, that is seen to be kind of liberal, enlightened, progressive, and they hate all that. Okay, so this idea of creating a progressive international order and a sensitivity to history would make a lot of sense. And there are opportunities there. But the forces that are making that are actually very anti-progressive and very reactionary, and see any enlightened progressive movement for the developing world or emerging powers or the global South, they would see that itself as a kind of liberal, elitist project, the very thing that they want to dismantle. So it's a very, very fine balance. That the spaces are opening out, I would agree with you. The spaces are opening out for reasons, not because the global south is necessarily empowered, but for other reasons. It's whether there's enough momentum that this opportunity is able to manage this rise of populism, this rise of different forms of nationalism, particularly in the West. Now, one response to that, of course, might be, as you say, the global south can do this themselves. Okay, the global south can generate their own response to this, and that there've been many movements for that. But ultimately, the argument here is the global south will need to trade and do trade and have global relations with the global north. That's part of that empowerment. That's part of that whole process. Or you get a situation where the global south uses this opportunity to decouple and de-link from this whole process and begin to set up its own institutions. That's been talked about for a while, and I would suggest, yeah, maybe these are opportunities now where that could really generate some kind of momentum. Whether that's built on the G20 or the G7, or especially the G20, or whether some independent movement in civil society or in South Asia or Southeast Asia, maybe states have been waiting for this moment. This has been the very moment they've been waiting for, and we see a complete recalibration of relations. That's very possible. But there is this other side to it, that this momentum, this opening is a result of forces which are not progressive, and which we see the rise of the global south again as a threat, and respond to it in that way. So yeah, very interesting dynamics emerging. So thank you for that. Thank you for that question.
I think you mentioned a very important point, I think, which is that the forces who are trying to make global order democratic and rule-based, sometimes in their own domestic politics, those forces are not respecting democracy enough, not based on rule-based. And that applies, in my mind, to global south also. If you look at, because when we say that American politics have become more nationalist and protectionist and populist, and all those European countries have become like that. And the thing is this trend is not limited to Europe, North America, or any particular part of the world. It's everywhere across the globe. Yeah. In all strata, you can say, suppose developed country, rich country to poor country, similar trends of nationalism and populism have been quite common. So I'm saying that all the alternate which we have been deliberating here, problem is that whether they are, because they are challenging them, because the same forces who are challenging Donald Trump's, you can say, populist agenda, they are in their domestic politics, they are doing the same. So I think they are not challenging basically American, that value, that idea, but basically they are trying to get some political mileage, some other, you can say. So I think it's a very, very important point which you raised. Professor Mekyo, it seems that you want to say something else. It's all right.
Okay. Yeah. Quite good. So the idea is, and the wider perspective. Thank you very much.
So thank you. The next question from Ulysses Alvija.
Yeah. Hi, hello. Good evening. I'm sorry, I got disconnected a while ago. So apologies for that. First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Watson, for that very comprehensive tale of thoughts about Korea's role with NATO amid so many different and differing foreign policies, orders, alliances. I am no foreign policy thingy knowledgeable, so just a caveat: you might find this question a little shallow. So obviously, with all these emerging alliances, the provoking concerns on Russia, North Korea military and economic support, the nuclear talks popping up, on your personal assessment or point of view, is a World War III a big potential in the near future? If so, what do you think is that one triggering point that would make that happen?
Okay. I would categorically no. Because the linking to the earlier point, because I think a lot of this has to do with domestic politics. So we've seen this very strange phenomenon where you get the same trends and patterns in the global north and global south. I think the word we use sometimes is kind of trans-populism, but you have populist movements in France, in Korea, in different parts of the world, quite authoritarian, all that kind of the culture, the politics of all this. And the paradox is they come from different countries, but they actually all share the same interests and they share the same idea. And they have a big stake in all this. So in terms of a conflict or a war where people talk about US and China, I think the individuals who are pushing the elites in the countries, domestic elites, we saw that recently with the tariffs. Trump pulled back the tariffs when it was impacting on the stocks and the bond markets and so on. There are so many elite interests, ironically, coming from the populist groups who are very anti-elite and very anti-establishment. They have so many interests in all this. They will not want to have any conflict. So a lot of it is kind of just for domestic audience, for domestic consumption. MAGA, in my country, Reform. If you know politics, you know that this is, this is all kind of all bluffing. However, there's always that trigger point, absolutely. So I would say that the trigger point would be essentially domestic, within domestic politics. That there may be an Eastern Europe has been looked at, Hungary, Turkey, the collapse of governments, the collapse of regimes, even the collapse of Putin's regime in Russia, the Kim Jong-un regime, seems pretty secure. Even in Beijing, there's a lot of concerns now. Xi Jinping, China technically, according to economic theory, is now trapped. But a domestic economy is not as strong as it was. There's a demographic issue because of the various one China policies now, the generational issues, expectations have been raised very high. That's where the trigger point could be. So I would say not so much an international trigger, but the regime collapse either in Russia or China. That's something that might trigger. But I think, again, the interest, because these, again, as I mentioned before, these elites in different countries, they are very well connected, the Trumps, the Putins, the Kim Jong-uns, and these are very, very wealthy billionaire individuals. They have a big stake in the current order, but they can also miscalculate as well. But that miscalculation will be domestic, and I think that could be contained, not very pleasant, but will be contained and be a warning to other leaders as well. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that could lead to a new era of authoritarianism. We're beginning to see that a little bit now. And the problem is in East Asia and certainly Asia Pacific is that the younger generation coming through who have never experienced what it's like to live under authoritarian rule, certainly many populists, many right-wing youngsters coming through see that as quite appealing. The strong leader theory, the great leader theory who gets things done, who says, I hate the establishment and I hate all these people, and that Argentina, I've forgotten his name now, in Argentina and so on. That generation of leaders coming through are looked up to in a lot of states now. They get a lot of support. So that would be the problem. So the democratic forces, progressive forces, even in my own country, are now seriously being squeezed out. And I can see a reform government in 4 years' time in Britain very, very easy, like a Le Pen in France, if his court case goes through and so on, an appeal. That's the problem. That's where the domestic politics is. That would be a trigger point, but it won't spread. It'll be very quickly put out because they've all got very, very similar interests in their different countries. So that's certainly from a Korean perspective, that's the really important question about this trigger, because everyone thinks North Korea, South Korea, the nuclear trigger, all that kind of thing. On that issue, actually, I would say that Korea having its own nuclear program would not necessarily be a problem. I don't think it would trigger much. I think because of the new context now, and one of the arguments from international relations theory about 10, 15 years ago was just let all countries have a nuclear weapon. Okay, because when they have a nuclear weapon, they become more responsible. They don't become erratic, this kind of madman theory and so on. They're very responsible because they got weapons and they know they could be in serious trouble. So it may be a risk, absolutely, but certainly from a Korean perspective, that's always been an issue to trigger a miscalculated missile or a miscalculated, something goes wrong. But I think in terms of what I'm saying here is that the more likely trigger would be a domestic regime trigger, which on the one hand is not good, quite clearly, but on the other hand, it does generate that sense that it can be contained domestically. And that's the pattern we're seeing. Yeah, the populists, ironically, who are very anti-everything, actually have a great big stake in the way things are, and they don't want to lose that. They're very happy with that. They might play games and they play bluff and all the rhetoric and so on, but actually they enjoy the system. They do not want to change it. So that would be my view. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, sir. Fair enough. Thank you.
Thank you. So, any other question? I think it seems.
I'd like to recommend a Korean, scholar, Professor Oh, okay, from Chungnam National University. Maybe I'd like to recommend to make some comments. Okay, this is very interesting topic. I know he's a morning person.
I'm very sleepy. Okay, I'm very glad to hear Professor Watson's presentation tonight after a long time since I saw your presentations in conferences.
Yes.
And I studied in Wales.
Aberystwyth, yes.
You might remember.
Yes.
So, just small thing. You seems to use the word the concept of collective security regarding NATO, the NATO. So, yes, I partly agree that the role of NATO has been transformed into a collective security organization, kind of, from previous alliance system. So, but again, as we are seeing reemergence of confrontational relations between some group of countries and some other countries, like today, Russia, China, even North Korea. So still, is it adequate for us to use the concept collective security regarding the role of NATO?
There is a lot of skepticism towards that now. Absolutely. I mean, in the Article 5, I suppose you could distinguish between collective security and collective security defined by Article 5. There's a kind of distinction there. And I would say that, yes, the collective security is now under a lot of pressure. Certainly, even not just from the US, but also within Europe as well. So you get this clash, if you like, between the kind of European Union members. And Macron in France was basically pushing this a few weeks ago to say, look, it's time now, and the EU's always talked about it's a time now for the EU to generate its own security organization. How that would happen, how that works, no one knows. But that puts the non-EU NATO members in a very difficult position. And you kind of redefine NATO as a kind of European alliance rather than a European Atlantic alliance. That can have a big impact. And of course, it has an impact for Britain as well, and its previous role as a kind of bridge between Europe and the US. So yes, there is, I would say, it's more open to interpretation now, collective security, and the willingness of other states to sacrifice for a trade competitor or for a next door neighbor, whoever it might be. But the interesting one I've looked at on this is the cybersecurity question, because cybersecurity is basically redefining where the red lines are for security. So there was a debate in NATO a few years ago, I think it was Article 5 debate about if there's an attack on an oil refinery or an airport through cybersecurity or even through traditional weapons because of the connection, because of the critical infrastructure, does that warrant a collective response? If it's just an attack on critical infrastructure or an airport, the Heathrow closed down a few weeks ago, that was thought to be a kind of Russian thing. Would that warrant a full-scale collective security? Because if it doesn't, then where is the threat? Where's the red line where you decide that should be a collective security response or it shouldn't be? And what I think, in my view, cybersecurity now has changed the parameters for the ability to withstand a security attack, but also redefine security itself. So I would say on the collective word, yes, there's that question about Article 5, about what we mean by collective. But I think the word security itself now is also changing. What security are we talking about? Is it traditional? Is it borders? Is it territory? Is it critical infrastructure? And of course, the problem for NATO is if it doesn't have an answer to that question and doesn't respond. My view is that I think Russia was provoking a little bit with the seen NATO's response to this, and the United Nations response actually be very quiet on Ukraine. That provocation, no one knows where that red line is anymore. And for that reason alone, this is why many people are saying, look, let's just forget NATO. We don't need it anymore. Okay, it's tried to get a post-Cold War identity, but it doesn't work anymore. And then another group is saying, well, actually, never more important to have NATO on this cybersecurity issue, because that's the key now. So I think a lot of the redefinitions of security would feed into think what you're saying there. And I would agree that question of collectivity is more problematic now, where that red line is, where that trigger is for a response. But it did take NATO a long time, from 1949 to 2001. There was no triggering of Article 5 until this attack on the US happened on 9/11. So, you know, it's a very long time anyway. For that reason alone, a lot of skeptics are saying we don't need it anymore. There's no point. It actually builds up expectations, a little bit like the United Nations. And building up expectations is always very dangerous in politics, because there's always a backlash when those expectations aren't met, which I suppose is a kind of realist view on this, but it's maybe a pragmatic view as well. So I think redefining security becomes a key question to that as well, I think. And I don't think there's any, at the moment, no resolution to that at all, especially for Korea. Although, as I mentioned, Korea has been very involved in the cybersecurity question, with especially the Baltic nations, actually, Lithuania and Latvia. Yeah, so I actually tend to agree on that point you raised there.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a very important point. I think Professor Khan wants to ask something.
Yes, yeah. Thank you, Professor Watson. I have just a simple question, because I don't have a very good idea about the NATO, this collective system, security system. In this area, I'm in the Northeast Asia. I think it's very ideal if there is the multilateral security system, collective security system. But as you know, the Korea is technically at war, right? Still war.
Oh yes, absolutely.
And there's Amidst, okay, and this is our security is mostly based on more bilateral, okay, alliance, okay, with the United States.
Yes.
I wonder when it comes to the NATO, I thought this is the collective security system of European area, okay, European boundary.
Euro-Atlantic, yes.
I know that Turkey is one of the members, but the out of Europe, like even Korea, Japan, okay, could it be regular members? Or could it be regular members or kinds of associate, okay, like associate with the NATO?
Yes.
I was very wondering. That is one thing, and even though we have a very strong relations or associate with the NATO, in terms of security, more I think we are more influenced by the United States, okay, our status of alliances or something.
Yes.
So our sometimes Korean position is not very concrete. I mean, they are not very concrete. I mean, not very independent sometimes.
Yes, sure. Yeah.
That is, I'm worried about it.
Yes.
And one more thing, they want a personal question to Professor Watson. You are from the UK, and the most international relations, I mean, the scholars of international relations, they started in Europe, right? In the United States, in Korea.
Yes.
So maybe there will be some different, like the Professor O, he studied in UK. So about your perspective about this area or something will be sometimes quite different from the scholars of who study in the United States, right?
Yes, definitely. Yes, exactly. So a few responses to that. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, NATO is a Euro-Atlantic organization. So in purely regional terms, it's not possible for Korea and Japan to be members, but Turkey is the interesting one. because Turkey is both European and Asian at the same time. It's always been a very interesting geography historically as well for Turkey. And that's actually one of the reasons regarding the European Union, that the European Union has always been very uncomfortable with Turkey becoming a member of the EU, because that essentially is expanding the EU, but expands the EU essentially into the Middle East, with borders with Iraq and countries that are way out of Europe. There's always that paradox of expansion and European identity. So this partnering program that Korea is involved with Japan, Australia, New Zealand, they all came together. So there is a partnership there. But the problem is Korea is not protected by any article of NATO. So it's a very ambiguous position. So it's involved with NATO and is subject to the same risks as NATO, but is not protected by NATO because it's not a member. So that's always been a kind of a weak point for Korea, unless there's some kind of Asian NATO emerges, which what I mentioned is a possibility. You're absolutely right. I would 100% agree. Yes, so it's still that bilateral alliance of the US is still very, very strong. We'll see how that goes. The Trump's first administration, there were some tensions with the progressive government of Moon Jae-in. There was issues, obviously, with the North Korea situation. We'll see how that plays out next time. But at the moment, yes, the Mutual Defense Treaty still very much holds. It's still then a legal obligation. I haven't really heard Trump saying much about that, so it's still there. But the difficulty is the context around that is very much changing now, which might have an impact. And there is a very, very big difference between American IR scholars and people like me who are educated in Britain and maybe even Europe as well, both in terms of methodology, in terms of how they see the world, the history, the culture, that kind of thing. So usually in Britain and Europe, we have methodology which is more kind of culturally based, more reflexive. Whereas in America, it's much more scientific, much more positivist, much more pragmatic in that sense. But I noticed when I used to go to conferences a long time ago now as a postgraduate student, when the American IR people and the British IR people talked, we had no idea what each other was saying. Very, very different methodologies, sometimes even different uses of English, which I found quite amusing. So this kind of there's a big gap between the kind of Atlanticist American and British European, which makes it very interesting in Korea, because most of the kind of IR people in Korea are basically all American. And when I read their work and read some of I have no idea their perspectives, where they're coming from, because to me it seems really very, very different from what I was taught and schooled in Britain. So and of course the UK relations of Korea are very different from US relations, although they're very similar during the Korean wartime. So there is a difference, absolutely. And the paradox is, I think those differences are getting bigger now as a result of more and more interaction. We are realizing that there is an even bigger gulf than perhaps we did even 20 or 30 years ago. So definitely that's an issue, which is when I first came to Korea, it was all basically all American. I couldn't understand it. It was all American. And so what's going on? There are other ways of doing this. So it's very, very strong in here in Korea. But I think there's other European voices, and also the global South voices are occurring now with students coming through and staying on to do PhDs. That's I've noticed that actually that's a big issue now. Very different perspectives in the global South, which is great. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I fully agree with your response. That sometimes looking from a third place gives you better perspective. Yes. Because US is in all possible way involved in East Asia very, you can say, intensely, and American scholars, knowingly or unknowingly, they are basically part of that debate. So sometimes I think somebody from UK studying about East Asia, somebody from India studying about Korea, yes. I think we have this advantage. There are some ignorance also which we probably have, but I think some neutrality, some objectivity also comes in, because we're not involved in the process at all.
Yes.
So I think so we really enjoyed your lecture. Any last thing you want to say, and then we'll close?
We'll wait and see. Obviously, quite an exciting time here in Korea, if the presidential elections coming up in a couple of months. That would be really interesting to see what happens there. And again, on a personal note, two things. I'm looking forward to meeting the group next week at Ajou. That'd be great to see you all there at Ajou campus. And again, thank you all very much for inviting me today and for those very, very kind comments. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Watson. I think now we are going to end this lecture and discussion. I think all of us, we agree that we had very comprehensive discussion about different things of what is rule-based order, what is NATO, what is American policy, how South Korea or other country, they can deal with that. So I'm not sure that whether we have got answers of all our questions, but definitely it has given some answers, at the same time raise certain other questions in our mind. So this is a very successful, very, you can say, rich discussion which we had. So we finally thank again Professor Iain Watson for this wonderful presentation. So thank you very much. And now up to Professor Khan.
Okay, thank you, Professor Watson. Okay, today's presenter and today's moderator, Professor Sandy Mishra. Okay, thank you very much. And it's your second, time to participate as a speaker, right, Professor Watson? Okay. Yeah. And so through this our forum, what you are connected with all our members and our networks. Okay. Okay, and some of the members here, Filipino students and Professor Bernard, they will visit. Okay, they will arrive this coming Sunday and next Friday. Okay, we'll visit soon and we'll drop by the Ajou University, and they will meet you in person. I will meet you in person.
I'll meet you in person the first time. Yeah.
What a small world. Okay. So we are looking forward to our meeting next Friday. Great. And all members, okay, thank you very much for your participation and this discussion. Okay, I will just announce before finishing, closing our forum. Next forum, our schedule. Okay, 2 weeks later, every 2 weeks, April 24th. Okay, April 24th. The topic is international criminal tribunals. Okay, our scholar who are the international law and politics, Dr. Veselin Popovsky, originally from Bulgaria, but he's based in Europe, in India, and sometimes in Japan. Okay, so I will announce this forum to all members, and if you still can spare time, I welcome you. Okay, so next 2 weeks later, okay, hope to see you, and everybody take good care and stay healthy. Okay, everybody, bye bye. Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Bye.
Okay, thank you.